So I'm going to talk about the energy yield modeling software that we are working at KIT, known as EVICalc. So today I'm going to present why energy yield modeling is important and why our group at KIT focuses on perovskite-based solar cells and what are the challenges to commercialize this type of solar cells and how we can use energy modeling to address these challenges or at least explore these challenges. And I will then describe the key features of the energy modeling software and the next steps and future of this software. So as we know, most of the studies in the context of solar cells are done on a well-known measurements known as a standard test condition or STC, which enables a good comparability by having a constant condition like typically 25 degrees of cell temperature, 1 sun irradiance or light intensity, and also the AM 1.5G spectrum. And it creates a benchmark for manufacturers and researchers to compare the results together to each other. And also due to its really swift test actually time, we can do it more times and repeat it to actually test it for different batches or different type of solar cells to compare it really fast. And also we can access to really important device performance parameters like the JV characteristics and also fill factor and power conversion efficiency. And also it's useful to optimize the cell and modules by identifying the intrinsic issues by plotting different curves on different tests at the level of the standard test condition. And also we can extract different parameters that also be used for simulation models like the ideality factor of the diode or surge resistance, shunt resistance, and the others. But with all of these benefits, are we able to reflect how solar cell performs in real world locations? So we know that the answer is no, because the standard test condition only actually consider one single operating point, which means one sun irradiance, and there is no considering seasonal variation of temperature or light intensity, and also it doesn't consider climate change. So and also there is no insight, like for example, how the solar cell is affected on cloudy days or sunny days, how different incident angles affect the performance, and how the temperature variation in day and night shifting or even in seasonal variation. And also it doesn't consider the spectral shift. So here, when energy modeling becomes important. So as I told you, we have a large uncertainty under a standard test condition, and also we cannot correctly compute the energy payback time and also optimize the device architecture correctly. But with help of energy modeling, by considering the spectral variations, different incident angles and temperature, and also different climate zones and locations, we can have better perspective of how the solar cell is going to perform in real world locations. So before going into details, let's just make a simple example that why is it important for optimization of the device architecture. So here I'm going to compare the optimal bandgap and thickness combination of a perovskite silicon tandem solar cell under standard test condition and in different locations. So results show that actually the optimal bandgap and thickness for this solar cell under standard test condition is 1.67 electron volts and 1 micrometer. When we go to a real-world location like Phoenix, known as high intensity and high temperature because it's a desert, so it shows that although the optimum band gap remains the same, but the optimal thickness decreased to half of the standard test condition. And when we compare it with another location like Seattle, which is a temperate location, it shows that both the optimum band gap and thickness reduced to 1.64 and 500 nanometers. So these results showed that the optimal bandgap and thickness depend on location and climate zone, and standard test condition cannot answer it alone. And we saw that the standard test condition result do not accurately reflect how solar cell performs in real-world locations. And that's why energy yield modeling is important. So before actually discuss about the software, let me introduce you our software. So this software is known as EVICalc, which is an open source project accessible by actually GitHub page of our software. And also it can model the different type of solar cells like single junctions or multiple junctions under both controlled lab conditions or realistic radiation conditions. And also due to its really swift operation, we can do the optimization really fast. And also here you can see the recent publications that our group published by using this software. So now let's talk about how this software works. So our energy modeling software consists of 4 different modules. The first module is the irradiance module that takes the meteorological data and like the NREL TMY3 dataset, and then it computes the clear sky irradiance with a smarts code, and then it computes and apply a simple cloud model to compute the direct and diffuse irradiance of each location. Then the optics module takes the data from architecture like the layer stack, like the thickness, coherent and incoherent layers, and then it can also take different morphologies into consideration. And then the output of these 2 modules are sent to the energy module to compute the JSC. So then this JSC is sent to the electrics module aligned with the diode parameters to compute the JV characteristics, and then they are sent back to the energy module to compute the energy yield. So the energy yield can compute the energy yield. I mean, it's the sum of the power generated by the solar cell in a course of a year or maybe multiple years. And it can also consider the axis tracking or bifacial cells or the different configuration of cells like 3-terminal, 2-terminal, 4-terminal. So now let's just make some examples that why energy modeling help us and how it can help us. So for example, let's start with a similar example to what I described earlier. So just consider again another perovskite silicon tandem solar cell, and then we are trying to know which thickness and bandgap combinations is optimal. So we can see here that the optimum bandgap and thickness is somewhere around here, 1.78 and also 600 nanometers, but it's under a standard test condition. And when we go to a real world location like Phoenix, it shows that actually somehow the maximum is around here. So we can see a shift in the thickness, but band gap remains the same. But when we go to so here is only for monofacial solar cell. And it means that only we can harvest light from the top side of the solar cell, but there is also a possibility to get light from the rear side. So in order to do that, we need just to change the rear side of the solar cell from is opaque silver to something transparent like ITO, and then it allows that light also actually absorbs from the rear side. So when we talk about bifacial modules, it means that we are going to consider albedo, and which means the reflection of the light from the ground and then absorbs by the rear side. So when we're talking about albedo, it means that the ground type is really important. So now let's compare the energy of bifacial solar cells with different ground types compared to the monofacial one. So here you can see the actual monofacial one as we saw before for Phoenix. As you can see here, depending on which type of ground we are going to use, not only the optimal band gap and thickness combinations change, but also the energy that we can get from the solar cell varies. So we can see that here somehow for bifacial with black ground, which means that there is no reflection flow ground, we have something like the optimal band gap and thickness like here, and the energy at maximum is around 480. But when we go to, for example, bifacial with ground of a bright sandstone, we can see that the energy will increase over 600 kilowatt hour per square meter per year. So it shows that actually a real and too much increase in the energy by only changing the ground type. And now it's good to compare it also for the other locations. Like, for example, now we were only focusing on Phoenix, which is a desert location. Now let's compare it with Portland. It's actually a temperate location, and Anchorage or Alaska, it's a really dry and cold location. So it shows that the best ground type is artificial white, which makes sense because the white do not absorb anything and reflects all the light back. And the next one would be snow, which also makes sense because it's white mostly. But the most interesting is that compared to the monofacial one, we can get up to 51% more actually energy from the bifacial module. And also the optimum band gap and thickness for each location can vary based on the ground type. For example, here it shows that for actual ground like snow, for Portland and Phoenix, the band gap of 1.56 is the optimum one, but with the same ground, optimum band gap for Anchorage is 1.62. Also, for example, here we can see that the optimum band gap for example, grass is somewhere around 1.82. And so we can see that both the energy and the optimum band gap changes with the type of ground and locations. So now let's consider another type of analysis, like the impact of texture on the tandem solar cells. So we can have three types of textures, which is the planar with the poorest light harvesting, or rear texture, which means that only silicon is textured, and also double side texture, both perovskite and silicon are textured. So now we are going to compare the rear texture and double side texture in the context of energy generation. So it shows that all over different locations, like from different climate zones of the United States, we can get the highest energy from double side texture due to its really good light harvesting. And also we can see that the least optimum texture is the planar, is expected because it cannot really good harvest light. And also we can see that the amount of energy that we can get from the double side texture depends on the location. For example, for a location like Miami, which is somehow different from the other locations, which is somehow a tropical location, we can get 2% more compared to the other locations. So again, here it shows that the location, climate zone, and all of these are important, but the standard test condition cannot take care of these data. So in summary, we found that energy modeling helps us really to optimize the device architecture, light management, and also we saw that how different type of solar cells, bifacial, monofacial, and also different textures can actually be improved in the context of energy. So as you may understand, my focus was only on perovskite solar cells, and which is actually focus of our group at KIT. And the reason is that due to the fast and rapid improvement in the efficiency of perovskite solar cells or perovskite-based tandems like perovskite silicon, we can actually see that it's really promising technology by having a perovskite silicon tandem record of around 35% efficiency, and for single junction perovskite is 27, and if you compare it with a silicon, it's 27.3%. And also we know that the silicon solar cells, it's been a while that they couldn't improve a lot, and we can see that it's really promising technology to work on. But as everything in life is not perfect, so something actually is a barrier to commercialize this type of solar cells. So now let's investigate what these factors are. So we can say that toxicity of the lead content that we use in the perovskite solar cells is one of the more important actually barriers. And more importantly, we can say that the long-term stability or degradation of the solar cells are actually really major and barrier to this commercialization, and it can be affected by temperature, light, humidity, and oxygen, and also the bias voltage. And also the other problem is scalability, which means that we can produce a really well performed devices in a small scale, but when we go to large scale devices with an increase in the aperture area, the device performance decreases. So now let's focus on one of the most important barriers, which is the long-term stability of perovskite solar cells. So the key degradation stress factors, as I mentioned, are temperature, light, and humidity or moisture, and oxygen, and also the bias voltage. So these are the stress factors which can cause or accelerate the known degradation mechanism in solar cells, like the halide phase segregation, ion migration or accumulation, pinholes, or recombination. So due to the halide and ionic structure of perovskite, we can have these degradation mechanism, movement of ions, or also the change in the phase of halide, so it can cause a degradation in the performance of the solar cells, perovskite solar cells. So we have really good studies in the context of degradation of perovskite solar cells, which provide really good insight into these trends of stability and degradation, and also enable accelerated evaluation of new materials and different materials. And also we can see and we can compare the device structure under identical stress with the other solar cells or with the other technologies. So, but there are some limitations of these current studies that we want to use energy modeling to answer to them. So the studies that are conducted under and in the context of degradations are either performed under controlled test environments, which are really short-term studies in, for example, 1,000 hours and 2,000 hours. And also there are accelerated stress, which means that they apply extreme temperature and extreme light, and there is no consideration of thermal cycling and radiance variation, which means that they do not consider the real world conditions. And so based on this, they are usually overestimating or underestimating the real world lifetime of the solar cells. Or the other type of actually studies are outdoor tests, which are again shorter, like 2,000 or 3,000 hours, and there are location specific results, which means that we can know when we actually study a cell in Saudi Arabia, we cannot understand what happens in Alaska or in, for example, Argentina. And also there are a low number of these studies because of high cost of equipment, frequent maintenance, and the other costs that they need. So here again is the energy modeling comes into our story to help us to estimate the lifetime of solar cells without waiting years and or accepting so much costs. So let's just look into the module framework before telling you how I modeled this. So this is the previous modular framework that I showed you, that how the energy modeling software works. But in order to actually consider degradation, we need to change this framework. So in order to do that, I changed the framework a bit, but I keep the optics module, and also its duty the same as radiance module. So they work the same as the previous version, but now, so when they are sent to the energy module to compute the JSC, I extract two more variables to send to the electrics module. So I extract the radiance or light intensity and also the cell temperature to consider the effect of the stress factors that I mentioned before for degradation. So these data aligned with degradation parameters, which I describe later, are going to be inserted into the electrics module, but there is an expansion to the electrics module that consider the degradation, which means, which I call it, for example, say degradation function. So this degradation function accounts for the impact of degradation, like the thermal and irradiance induced degradation on the performance of the solar cells, and then it sends these data to the electrics module along with the diode parameters to account for the JV characteristics, but now after degradation. And so these JV characteristics, or the new JV characteristics, are sent to the energy yield module again to get the energy yield. So the only change that is applied is that the electrics module is expanded by adding a degradation function, and also extract some more variables from irradiance module, and also the first iteration of energy yield module to actually consider the impact of degradation. So, but how did we study degradation? So degradation in our study that I'm going to show you, and also in the model, is studied in the solar cell parameters. What are the solar cell parameters? Are the fill factor, JSC, and VOC. So we started degradation in these solar cell parameters, and then we study how they can affect the energy of the solar cell. But these studied of degradation in the solar cell parameters are implemented at the level of diode parameters. So what are the diode parameters? They are shunt resistance, surge resistance, J0, collection efficiency, and J0. So what it means? It means that when we are studying degradation in fill factor, the degradation in fill factor is caused by a decline in shunt resistance or either an increase in the surge resistance. The same way the degradation in the short circuit current density is studied by a decline in the collection efficiency, and the degradation in open circuit voltage is studied by increase in the dark saturation current density. But why is it important to consider the degradation at the level of diode parameters? And why is it useful to do it in the context of energy yields? So here I'm going to show you one example from my paper. So I studied the impact of 0.5% and 2% and degradation in the top cell of a tandem solar cell in a standard test condition and Phoenix. So again, these degradation rates that I mentioned are for each solar cell parameter. So when we see the result, we can see that the standard test condition and the real world location like Phoenix respond differently to degradation. For example, here, if you look at the impact of JSC degradation on the performance of solar cell under standard test condition, we can see that the impact of this degradation is reduced around 40% or more than 40% in the performance. But here we can see that it's near 60% when it comes to Phoenix. Also, when we go, for example, for fill factor degradation due to an increment in surge resistance, the impact of this degradation under a standard test condition is more than under a real-world location like Phoenix. So it shows that a standard test condition, again, is not translated one-to-one to what happens in a real-world location. But why is it important to do it at the level of diode parameters? So let's compare two things. I mentioned that the degradation in fill factor can be studied due to a decline in shunt resistance or an increment in surge resistance. So we can see that if the degradation in fill factor is caused by a decline in shunt resistance, we can have something up to 60% of loss in the energy after 30 years. But for the surge resistance case, it's less than 40%. So we can see that even if the same solar cell parameter, which is fill factor, the responsible for this degradation is important. And now let's actually make another example. Let's look at it from the other perspective. So we saw that what happens to the energy yield if we have some amount of degradation. But now let's see how much we are allowed for degradation in different parameters to have a degradation rate similar to silicon solar cells, like 0.5% annually. So it shows that the rate of this acceptable degradation varies for each solar cell parameters. Like, for example, for VOC, if we want to have a 0.5% annual degradation rate, the VOC can degrade to up to 80%, but when it comes to JSC, it can be around 15%. And again, for fill factor, depending on what diode parameter is responsible for this degradation, the rate or the acceptable rate varies. For example, for Archon is only 12%, but for Cersei is up to 30%, which shows that again, the diode parameters or the responsible for this degradation are important, but it shows that what is the main cause of increase in surge resistance is not that much important. We have a lot of room to have an increase in surge resistance, but what causes a drop in shunt resistance is actually a really tricky thing. So for example, the main cause of shunt resistant drop would be the imperfection in the perovskite bulk or maybe the pinholes. And these things mean that we should care more about the imperfection in the perovskite if we want to have a degradation rate the same as the silicon solar cells. So, but we saw until now that degradation under the standard test condition is not one-to-one translated to real-world locations, and also it's crucial to study at the level of diode parameters. And previous studies that I showed you, we didn't consider the impact of the stress factors. So more importantly, temperature and light. So now let's see what happens if we enter them into the modeling. So how would temperature and light-induced degradation affect the lifetime of the solar cell? So let's start with a simple example. Let's just try to model or see the impact of different constant temperature on the performance of the solar cell, but in dark. So we don't have any impact of light now, and we have different temperatures, and we consider that the decline in the shunt resistance is responsible for degradation, and we can see the impact on the performance. So it shows that the top cell shunt resistance follows expected Arrhenius type exponential decay. So the Arrhenius type exponential decay is usually used to model the temperature-induced degradation. As you can see here, this Arrhenius model depends on two important parameters like the temperature and the activation energy, or EA. This activation energy shows how sensitive our degradation is to temperature variation. And then we can saw that when we have higher temperature, we have higher performance we have higher performance loss. So now let's just make it a bit similar to real world locations, which means that we have a change in the temperature and it's not always constant. So in order to do that, let's consider the cyclic temperature profiles, 3 cyclic temperatures like the line peak, medium peak, and short peak, and as a representation of summer day, spring day, and winter day. And again, we see the impact on the shunt resistance by considering the Arrhenius model, and then we can see the impact on the performance. So again, we see that the similar overall degradation happens, but it means that, for example, for the line peak cycle, as expected, we have the highest drop in the performance. But now we can see that the trajectory of this degradation is not a constant line, but it varies based on the shape of the temporal stress or the temperature change. And also we can see that, for example, for short peak cycle, which shows, for example, winter day, it's somehow we get the performance loss similar to the constant exposure to 80 degrees, which makes sense because the average temperature of this short peak cycle is 85 degrees. So it means that the performance loss should be more or less the same. But now let's add light. So before this, so for these examples, we only consider thermal stress and in the dark. Now let's add light to see what happens. So when we talk about light, it means that there are two possible scenarios. So light can introduce a new degradation mechanism, which means that the activation energy, or EA, that I showed you in the formula for Haynes model can drops, or it doesn't actually introduce a new degradation mechanism, and it's just accelerate the existing degradation mechanism. So before going into details, so we saw that we have different stress factors for degradation, like temperature, light, humidity, oxygen, and bias voltage. And we have some degradation mechanisms like halide phase segregation, ion migration or accumulation, and for example, pinholes or recombination. Each of these degradation mechanisms have an activation energy, which means that these, if, for example, the degradation triggers that energy or reach that energy, the degradation mechanism starts to happen. So, and these activation energy can vary based on each degradation mechanism. So for example, the activation energy for halide phase segregation is different from pinholes. And when we are adding light, so we should also try to consider the impact of the light on the degradation rate. So one of the way to model the impact of light and the degradation is using the power law, which means that we can have this equation, which means the light intensity to the power of gamma, or light exponent. This light exponent is also dependent on the degradation mechanism, but more importantly, on the type of solar cell that we are using. So for example, actually the rule of thumb or benchmark for this gamma for perovskite silicon solar cells or for perovskite is 0.7. So now let's see at these examples. So let's consider a constant light and the impact of that on the performance, and just consider that when we add light, a new degradation mechanism is going to happen. So it means that we have a reduce in the activation energy. For thermal only case, I use 0.6 electron volt, but now let's reduce it to 0.495, which means that we have a faster degradation, of course, which makes sense because we had light. But let's see how it changes. So we can see that based on the light intensity, at the higher light intensity leads into higher loss. And also we can see that by increasing the light from 0.4 sun to 1 sun, we can see that the time or the lifetime of the solar cell is decreased by 50%. So let's just let me show you. So for example, for 0.4 sun light intensity, and when we apply it, the lifetime of the solar cell or T30 of the solar cell is 1000 hours, but when we increase the light intensity to 1 sun, it's 500 hours. So we can see that, and it's somehow expected because this relationship is not linear, and so we can see that how fast it can affect the performance. Now let's consider that the light actually does not introduce a new degradation mechanism, but it accelerates only the existing degradation mechanism. So it means that we don't have a change in the activation energy, but this A or pre-exponent factor changes to get faster degradation. So now we can see that, for example, for a constant light intensity and cell temperature, how the solar cell performance varies by adding light, and also for different gamma. So it shows that for example, only at thermal stress, we have 3% of performance loss after 2000 hours. But when it comes to combined light and temperature, it can get to about 65 to 68%. But more importantly, it means that we, based on the different values of gamma, like for example, even it's 1 or even it's 0.4, we don't see a much drop in the performance. So for example, by decreasing it, for example, from 1 to 0.4, which is a 60% of decrease, we just only get 4% of performance loss in the actually combined degradation. But these are only for lab conditions. But what happens to the real world location? So now let's try to have first a cyclic light to emulate the real world seasonal light intensity variation. So consider two peaks like the short one and the long one. And again, we see that similar degradation shape occurs. We have, for example, the long peak has the highest performance loss and short peak has the lower one. Then the trajectory is somehow having the shape similar to the temporal structure, the shape of the thermal and light actually change. And we can see that the short peak cycle has a somehow degradation or performance loss similar to 0.6 constant sun illumination. But we know that, as we talked, that standard test condition or lab condition cannot answer to what happened in real world location. So let's now consider two things: the ESOS tests, which is a standard lab tests, and also the cyclic light intensity I showed you before, and compare it with two locations like Phoenix and Seattle. So now let's first see how the temperature and light intensity in these locations change. So we can see that Phoenix has a temperature maximum of 50 degrees reaching summer, and also, but for Seattle is somehow half of that. But for example, in ESOS L tests, which is a light soaking test, the temperature used is 80. Somehow it's near 2 times of the maximum temperature of Phoenix. So it shows that why these tests are not realistic, and we cannot see how the lifetime changes in real world location. And also you can see that the light intensity average in Phoenix is, for example, near 4 sun at its maximum, but it's 2.5 sun for Seattle, while, for example, for ESOS test, it's constant 1 sun. So now let's see the impact. So again, we consider the actually shunt resistance is responsible for this degradation, and then we are going to see what happens on the performance. So it shows that the T85, which means the time that cell needs to reach to its 85% of initial performance for in situ tests, is around 15 days, while it is for Phoenix 6 months, and for Seattle is a year. And for T90, which is, for example, for in situ is around 10 days, and for Phoenix in 5.5 and Seattle 9.5. What shows is that the in situ tests has a really rapid degradation in the beginning of the tests, but for real world locations, it's not that much rapid. And for example, we can see that there's not so much difference between, for example, Phoenix and Seattle, and T85 and T90. And then when we compare the degradation pattern, as I showed you that, for example, for ESOS test is a rapid exponential, but for Phoenix, we can see that it's first really slow, and then when it comes to summer, we have a peak in temperature and light, the degradation becomes faster. And for a location like Seattle, which is somehow temperate location, not have so much peak light and temperature, the degradation is always gradual and slow. The 1 year loss in Phoenix is about 40%, but for Seattle is 14%. It means that if you want to have this amount of degradation in an ESOS test, we should have, when we have only 250 hours for an ESOS test, we reach to 40% of loss, which is equivalent to 1 year loss in the real world location. And for Seattle, which has a lower degradation, only 170 hours, we reach to Seattle. But for Seattle, it takes 1 year to reach this amount of performance loss. And also we can see that the cell under lab conditions, it reached to 30% of initial performance after 20 days, while it takes for Phoenix 3 years and Seattle 8 years. So it shows that how actually these degradation tests under lab conditions cannot really say what happens in real world locations. So maybe I think I can finish my presentation here. So because I think it's now 1 minute, but maybe there are some questions, so maybe I can stop it here and do that. I don't know, Marilu.
Yeah, perfect. I mean, do you want to have a conclusion, or is that good like this?
So actually, maybe I can go to the conclusion because I can just do that. So actually, as I showed you, the focus on energy yield is because that a standard test condition on what we see in their lab analysis does not account what happens for real world locations. So because if we want, because we are working at solar cells, it means that one day we are going to sell it to the industry or anywhere that they are going to use it in a real world location, and we need to consider what happens in real world location. And I showed you different examples, including the architecture or, for example, texture of the solar cell, and up to the intrinsic issues that different technologies of solar cell have. So all of them, if we want to know what really happens in the real world location, needs either outdoor tests, which are really costly, or we can use the energy modeling software that helps us to somehow, with a good accuracy, predict what happens in a real world location. So for the future of our software, we are going to also adopt the software for module level. But now for, as I said, we only have cell level. But when we are going to consider, for example, for commercialization of solar cells, we are going to consider also the module level and how it affects the performance. And also, for example, the software that we are working is only now available in MATLAB, but the Python version is under work. So we will publish the Python version soon.